Well, hello, good evening. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Want to start just right on time to try to squeeze every possible second of this conversation that we know is going to be a very engaging and enlightening. So let me start introducing myself. My name is José Enrique Arrioja. I'm the managing editor of the Americas Quarterly, the independent publication of the American Society and the Council of the Americas. I'm here tonight as a pinch hitter because, as you know, in our program, my esteemed editor-in-chief and Brian Winter couldn't stay tonight for this event due to personal reasons. However, I'll try to do my best in order to keep this conversation as well and cohesive as possible. We thank you all really for the time given and for your interest about Latin America. For tonight, we have a very special guest, a person who has a deep and direct understanding of Latin American realities. From 2017 through 2019, Juan Cruz worked with the National Security Council as a special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Throughout his career, Juan, let me call you Juan if you allow me to, has served in multiple diplomatic posts, including U.S. embassies in Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela. As you can imagine, Juan has a remarkable understanding of the complexities of the region and is very well aware of the government's decision-making process. Today, Juan is an independent consultant on Latin American affairs, and he is also a geopolitical strategist working as a senior advisor for Dinámica Americas, a Washington-based consultancy group. So it's our great honor to have you here tonight, Juan, and we totally appreciate that you made the trip from DC to the nation capitals to New York. Before we begin, I wanted just to tell you more or less the rule of engagement that we have for tonight. We're going to be just talking for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to be just taking questions from the audience. I'm going to just be specific, and I need your help with this to make the questions as direct as possible in order to, as I mentioned earlier, squeeze the last drop of knowledge from Juan's participation tonight. We also am going to please ask you and take the opportunity, if you allow me to ask you to join the Americas Society, because through that specific initiative, we are able to do events like this one. We are able to convene all under the same roof to discuss ideas and to review the most pressing issues in the region, not only in politics, but also in economics, culture, and education, and others. My colleague, Holly, should be around here in the room. You probably met her earlier and downstairs. So we highly appreciate and we'll be really grateful if you consider joining, starting this very interesting 2026. We have anything else to add? I wanted to just welcome again Juan and ask you this very first fundamental question. You work with President Donald Trump during a couple of years, a very interesting and very busy couple of years during his first term. Where do you see him, or what do you see him right now seeing the region? What do you think is driving his policy towards Latin America as we speak today?
Well, thank you, Jose Enrique, and good evening to everyone. And maybe the first thing I'll do is to thank the Americas Society and Council of Americas and the entire team here, Holly, for the heavy lifting behind the scenes, and all the team members here for pulling this together. Thank you. Very good question, Brian. When he first approached me on speaking to you tonight, this was, maybe early mid December. we knew that by this date, probably the U.S. would have already acted militarily in Venezuela. But we wanted to make sure that we made this event more than just Venezuela. And so the first question being a really interesting one, because I'll draw from the national security strategy, and I'll start off a little provocative. Everyone got behind the bandwagon, and you hear quite commonly said that the new shift is towards the Western Hemisphere. My own public comments early on, a little to be controversial, a little bit to be provocative, was to say that I didn't think so. That is a slightly different view. And because what I do think is that the president has a clear vision of what he wants from the hemisphere. And it's not in its totality, and it's not going to include a lot of the things that we'd normally be seeing, sort of like, democracy and development and all countries involved. I think it'll be very reflective of Donald Trump's interest in an America First foreign policy that follows very strictly 2 or 3 or 4 issues, and not more than those, and not all the countries. And so it's often difficult for us to accept and digest that, because it's kind of counterintuitive, and we want to project onto the president his interests. Well, I would say ultimately his vision is an expansionist one. He has an affinity for expansionist presidents, whether it's citing them in his inaugural address or putting their portraits in the Oval Office or elsewhere. And I think what you need to think of in terms of that is, what does he feel his role is going to be, his legacy in history as a president of this nation, and how he sees the hemisphere as an integral part of the United States, its past and its future, and not something new and innovative. You've just discovered the hemisphere, and the U.S. will be tied to it. So it's a little long. I want to, if there's any other thought I'd leave with you, is I put a lot of value in your time and your interest. So at the end of this, what I think it will be most important are your questions, right? Not just what I'm saying to you, but what you want to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Since the very beginning of the second term, the president started with very, very direct decisions, naming foreign terrorist organizations to a bunch of cartels operating in the region, from Mexico, Venezuela, Haiti, Colombia, and so on. And from that moment onward, we have seen events until the recent capture of Nicolás Maduro on January 3rd. This sort of like a very active approach. Do you expect to continue as we move forward in this year?
Absolutely. And the way I look at it is that we heard a lot of complaints early on about Southern Spear, and what his ultimate end game was going to be, and whether Venezuela was regime change or whether it was counter drug, an issue I never understood, because in the end it was the same target, same solution. But in looking at all this and what it represents for the region, it's just not a single episode. People were complaining that, was this a bluff? Is he going to follow through with it, and at what cost? And I had to sit there and think for a second, what does the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine actually mean, which is muscular, right? It means that you're going to follow up with what you say you're going to do. And I looked at 8 years of the Teddy Roosevelt's, as president for 8 years, 01 to 09, and how many times he intervened in those 8 years. And if you use very fuzzy math, maybe you can come up with 4 times. So it's not about the intervention, it's about the message. And I would say that Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And Donald Trump is speak loudly and carry a big stick. Make sure that everyone understands exactly what you mean, and don't leave it up to them to figure it out and interpret you. So when you cite these other countries, what I would say to you is, maybe it's not even about countries, because I could go into like some messaging here that you probably don't want to hear, or you do want to hear. But this is a single policy. And so while we might sit here and artificially talk about whether this is something that next gets projected in a place like Colombia or in Mexico, which we all know are probably, the top candidates, or elsewhere, as he has said himself, I think we should talk less about borders and boundaries because drug traffickers are transnational actors. And so I think what you should do is you should expect this sort of thing to take place anywhere it's found. And unfortunately, I predict that probably it's not if, but when we'll act in a place like Mexico militarily, despite the very best efforts of President Sheinbaum, who's representing her country and her people, but President Trump is representing his people and their interest.
Speaking of Mexico, and we're getting into the granularity of this conversation, and I'm very thankful that you are mentioning specific that we started the week. So the tone of the week, if you allow me to, was this conversation, the 15 minutes conversation, this sort of an emergency call that President Sheinbaum plays to talk with President Trump. Um, what do you make? What do you make of the conversation that? We know that President Chamber has been trying to reestablish or reset the relationship as a whole between Mexico and the U.S. from the very beginning. And first, your interpretation of the call, and then your assessment of how the situation is probably evolved from here.
I think the call went predictably. She's become very good at handling the president. She has one way of handling the president and the messaging and the narrative there. And then a second way, she speaks to her own people and the interpretation of that call. And I think the president appreciates that. You get to tell the story any way you want. And we all recognize as well that she's worked really hard in cultivating this relationship and making sure that the president doesn't go to the darkest sort of, corner of the room. Um, Unfortunately, this is kicking the can down the road. The part of the Trump corollary is if you can't do it yourself, we're going to do it for you. And we're not going to ask permission. But you'll have the opportunity to solve your own problems. But when those problems involve us, we have an obligation. And I think she's done swimmingly well. It's probably not a favor to her that people repeatedly say that she's been successful with President Trump because I don't think that's going to play well with him. But in the end, it happens to be true. How far can she carry it out? And then when it actually happens, how will she handle it?
Would you say that the cooperation that Mexico has in place that has been increasing and even sending troops, do you remember, 10,000 soldiers to the border trying to cooperate, enhancing communication, exchange of information, and so ever, the capture of recent, kingpins in the country, the extradition to here, etc. Will those elements be enough? Will satisfy President Trump's sort of like an emboldened position nowadays and prevent a scenario of intervening in the country?
She's been exceptional, and this buys her time. And among some of the very, smart decisions when she found out that two of these maritime vessels that were attacked and sunk were off of the coast of Mexico, she quickly had the government work with the United States so that these kinds of incidents would be shared and given the Mexico the opportunity to act on its own against these threats. I think again, another brilliant way to approach these things, but how long can she keep this up? We've got 3 more years and I just don't think she has that much creativity left or that Donald Trump has enough patience.
The formal review of the USMCA is due in July. And that, of course, has been one of the key elements to watch for, in this year. However, this current environment makes you think, is that going to be really relevant? And if so, how do you see the interaction and the negotiation of that and that key trade agreement?
Well, the tariff situation has been already eating away at the USMCA. And the president's, we all know he's not fond of, multilateral agreements. And there's nothing worse than negotiating with someone who doesn't care about something falling apart. Now, I think too much is made about him being the the parent of USMCA and somehow that protecting it from its disappearance. My own view and the view of the consultancy that I'm with, a lot of smart people in Dynamic Americas, including Roberta Jacobson, who was the ambassador while the negotiations of USMCA were both under Obama and the beginning of the Trump administration. Our conclusion, if I dare say, is probably it probably won't survive.
Probably won't survive.
Will not survive.
Why? Why do you think? What is the likelihood of that scenario?
I think that likelihood is as much as anything else. It's just the Canadians and the Mexicans will have to give a lot. And like I said, when you're negotiating and your final position, you don't care about which direction it takes. He's not he would rather sign a bilateral trade agreement with each country.
Um, we know, and this is one of the experts the other day was talking and explained this to us, that they have the possibility of saying, hey, we don't need to actually renew the agreement, in July we can, postpone the revision or for another year, and then even for a couple of years. Do you see that as a possibility, given the circumstances?
I actually was fearful that the way it's written is that no later than 2026, but it could have been done earlier. And there was some talk at some point at moving the dates up by the United States, which would have caught both Mexico and Canada, I think, by surprise. It didn't happen, but I think the U.S. probably would have been prepared to do that. I don't know. I think that there's an expiration date to all of this, and that the president will have an opportunity to weigh in, and ultimately he's the most important vote in all this.
Let's dive into Venezuela. What is your assessment of what the administration has done, and what carried out in the dawn of January 3rd, capturing Nicolás Maduro, and eventually announcing the president in that famous press conference on Saturday that the U.S. will run Venezuela, and since then I've been particularly being a Venezuelan, I've been particularly surprised by the fact that immediately after the announcement we have been communications, a fluid communication between the two governments, and contrary to any expectations, when you have an aggression of this kind, countries normally serve, suspend international and diplomatic relationships, etc. Right now, we're seeing the possibilities of, restarting those ties. No, so I want you to pick your brain and tell us what do you think.
Jose Enrique, there's a lot that could be said about Venezuela. It could eat up all the time today and another few hours. I certainly have a lot to say about it, but I'll try to be respectful of everyone's time. What we've seen in Venezuela is really just the tip of the iceberg. A very difficult tip. What the United States pulled off is miraculous and is a lesson to many friends and adversaries alike. But the truth is that it is just the tip of the iceberg, and like most icebergs, the important part underneath is just as dangerous, if not more. Certainly challenging. The president is a person who's not fond of forever wars or long engagements or nation building or anything of that sort. And the U.S. has learned a lot. We're excellent at war and kind of crappy at peace. And to work on that in Iraq and Afghanistan or Haiti have been abject failures. Why? Because of the hubris, the arrogance of the United States that thinks it can impose something like this on countries that simply aren't prepared for it. Not to say that Venezuela falls in that category, of course. But what this does is it creates in the president a desire to avoid inheriting that aspect. And in administrations, multiple Democrat and Republican administrations, one of the things that dominated the conversation of Venezuela was, if we are able to help the opposition come to power, how do we help them govern? Because it's almost ungovernable. And the security situation that they won't be able to control, and a lot of the aspects of the country that are beyond their capability, how do we prepare them to take on such an incredible responsibility? And the biggest one being where they don't control security in the military. Well, Donald Trump solved that. We don't have to because you have a regime, and those that who may be cooperating reluctantly against their will, but they're cooperating. And they're the ones who are going to be responsible in the rebuilding of the country, where when he says he's in charge, he doesn't mean the U.S. in charge. What he means is the regime isn't in charge. They're not in charge of their airspace or their economy or the oil or anything else. And so when the United States, in this case, when Donald Trump says he's in charge, he means he's going to guide them through this process of rebuilding and be able to buttress themselves and restore enough of the country and its economy from all this kleptocracy that's taken place beforehand, so that when it's time for a democratic transition, the opposition comes in, we give them a chance at success and not a chance of failure, which would have happened. Now, a lot could be said about this. We could spend a lot this evening talking about it, but the bottom line of this is that this is an America first view of it. The U.S. took an enormous risk and, of course, a lot of criticism and very little support to do something that everybody agrees should have been done: the removal of a heinous dictator. Now, whatever comes next, it'll be complicated. Well, some of these things we'll get right and some we get wrong. And why? Because nobody always gets it right. But we've learned a lot in this. And it's not going to be Panama, because Panama is small and there was a huge U.S. presence and boots on the ground. The president doesn't want to do that. He's willing to do it, but he doesn't want to. In the best interest of the recovery of Venezuela is that the Venezuelans be in charge of that and not the United States.
And as you know, since the um, recent administrations, starting President Trump first term, Joe Biden, in Venezuela, everybody was just thinking about, hey, the United States is trying to help Venezuela to restore democracy. Do you think that that will be the final outcome of all this process?
I don't think it's a direct objective by the president. The president wants Venezuela to be restored in a Venezuela that he knew. In my experience with him, and this is a question I often got, was, why does the president care about Venezuela? Why is he so intent and why is he investing so much? It's one of two issues that I knew were organic to him. No one suggested it. Nobody convinced him. Nobody got him in a corner and argued why this was important. It was the opposite. He's a big and huge believer in Venezuela. And part of it was that he witnessed personally Venezuela often at its best. And he knows what the country's capable of being. Now, all he's interested is in restoring that. Now, democracy, it's not that it's not discussed, is that there'll be a room for democracy along the way. And if you look at the U.S. policy under President Trump, it's been bicephalous, right? It's been two-headed. It's at one point it looked like one of the factions would outplay the other. I would argue that what we have today is a combination of both of those factors: a decision to act solidly and in a determined fashion in Venezuela, and at the same time look at the ways that you can take advantage of maneuvering, pressuring the regime into a different kind of behavior, and certainly lessen their control over aspects of the country like its economy.
Would you define this as a tutelage, as a former tutelage on Venezuelan government? Secretary of Energy Chris Wright mentioned last week that the U.S. will be controlling the sales of oil, for the foreseeable future. All right, and President Trump also as well, has been saying, hey, this is going to be for the long run. How do you define the scheme, the scenario that we are confronting and dealing with in Venezuela?
Uh, I'm a history geek, and I've tried really hard not to give you history lessons tonight. Not the first time that the U.S. has acted in Venezuela, not militarily, but in order to support and buttress their economy in the region. Historically, when we've intervened, it's come in largely two flavors, and one of them has been to impose discipline in countries that have lost their way and ended up controlling their customs houses or their central banks or their treasury, whether that's in the Dominican Republic or Haiti, influence of Venezuela and in other places. It's happened more than once. And I think this, if you look and go back to what we're saying about expansionist presidents and what they've done in the region is to set discipline and order. This is one of those things.
Let me just turn the page quickly, talk about a central character in all these recent actions. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban descendant, has been particularly adamant and crafting this policy towards Latin America. The question for you is, how do you assess what he has done, and should we expect the next target of this policy being Cuba?
Wow. For the next 3 hours, I will be. So I've briefed Secretary Rubio on many occasions, both when I was at the White House and before then. I never found a person who was who really had more control, dominance over a topic like him and Venezuela. There was virtually nothing I could mention, discuss that he didn't already know, more than any other country. I would argue that someone with his patina and credentials to hold the office of Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, sort of that totality. We haven't seen somebody like that in a while. And so he's the right person, and he has the right instincts, and he understands the region, and he understands the players, and so forth. So we're lucky to have him there. It'll be interesting because we're all products of where we come from, and the U.S. right now is riding a wave, right? It's optimism, excessive optimism. We've been very lucky in this operation in Venezuela. It's a lot to be proud of, but it also provides maybe a false sense of optimism, right? Like everything can be resolved like this, and we know it can't be, but it's understandable. It's human nature. My own personal view is that a place like Cuba, and when those of you who monitor Cuba know that it's in the worst situation it could possibly be. And I think the trickle of oil that the Mexicans will eventually throw Cuba's way is actually kind of cruel. It's not enough to get them out of the problem, but just enough to keep them in hunger. The Mexicans aren't doing the Cubans any favors. And in the end, they never recovered from COVID. Their economies tanked. The major ways to earn money is non-existent. They import sugar, for Christ's sake. That's insane. No tourism. COVID destroyed them, right? And the whole business of renting out your medical personnel is drying up and was coming at a cost. So every door they open, there are no options. I would actually prefer to let them disappear on their own, because then we don't own any of it and they own it all. And these are hardcore individuals where if we start giving them a reason and back them up against the law, I think that they're willing to go down with the ship, which is not good for the Cuban people. At the end of the day, I thought it was smart that the president has kind of backed off on, he's told them your days are numbered, and it's okay reluctantly for the Mexicans to throw them a life preserver, a rickety water-soaked life preserver in some
By selling the oil,
by
selling
giving the oil.
Mm.
And I think that in the end, the Cuban, if you follow the Cubans recently, there's a couple like miracles here. If you hear the self-criticism that takes place among the Cubans and when they get together, and whether in Congress or they're having televised meetings, the incredible honesty of how poorly they're doing and how lousy a job it's I mean, historic. I think because no one would believe you if you tried to say anything else. But secondarily, in this operation in Venezuela, where they come out and admit that 32 of their
Yeah.
best executive protection agents were evaporated by U.S. forces. Some of those bodies haven't been found yet. One colonel, two lieutenant colonels. These are the same people that protect their leadership. If they admitted 32, I bet we're talking at least 132, right? But these are new things. And so for Rubio and Cuba, I hope that the administration follows the President Trump's instinct in making a clarion call and then backing off and letting the Cubans, go down on their own, and that we don't, the Cubans know that they don't have a chance against us, but they're going to put up a hell of a fight. It's best to let them, die on the vine, and hopefully we'll get something like Romania, right?
That is a possibility there. Juan, let me bring you to other parts of the region, taking advantage of you.
By the way, Romana Ceausescu, 1989.
No, taking advantage of your knowledge in it. We have countries such as Colombia that we're gonna have presidential election just around the corner. On May 31st is going to be the first round vote, and then that one will lead us to a second round, a potential second round in June. So let's start with Colombia, and then we tackle Brazil, another country with an important critical electoral process this year. The relationship between President Petro and President Trump has been, complicated since the very beginning. However, and we saw the recent events last week with that also famous call between the two leaders. And now we're gonna have President Petro eventually visiting the White House in early February. Do you think that this truce will last?
My job, one of the aspects of my job in the White House was to prepare the president for every phone call he had with a foreign leader and every personal meeting. That means you brief and you cover the issues and you talk about the last time they spoke and that sort of thing. And I witnessed a lot of these meetings go down. And what I would say is, you never know what's going to take place in that meeting in the Oval Office, and there's no way you can predict it. And I wouldn't want to be Petro in early February meeting with the president on his turf in the Oval Office and think that somehow it's going to end up in a good situation for you. Now, why did the president do this? The president has a very determined view of his style, and we've seen him do this before. He spoke to Maduro personally. He wants to talk to Xi. He wants to talk to Putin. He wants to talk to the mullahs in Iran. He wants to talk to Kim. Why? He wants to give a chance that he knows that he's been able to personally break through on some issues because of his style. And he wants to give it a chance. He's going to give this a chance. But it doesn't mean that he's giving you whiplash or that he's changed his mind. He said an awful lot. And I remember I said there are two things that the president is authentically, organically interested in. One is Venezuela. The other one is counter narcotics. And he can't possibly, if he was tough, and I saw it on President Duque and President Santos, we have historic production of cocaine in Colombia. I just don't see how he gets off the hook.
And right now, cocaine production is an all-time high.
Right, historic there, and by the way, in all the places that produce cocaine is at a historic high. And as you saw, the president feels he has an obligation to protect his people from those things that are killing them.
We have seen President Trump comments on recent votes in the region having a significant impact on that. The support that he drove on Javier Milei in Argentina, and eventually announcing this 20 billion package to support the economy and eventually the midterms elections. And then, we saw also in Honduras most recently. Do you expect in some way that President Trump will be just in some way speaking about it or making this sort of like a out of the blue announcement, and eventually also steering the election in one way that will eventually support the right in Colombia.
Well, I think you could pretty much expect the president to voice his opinion on any candidate he wants, and no one's going to stop him. And if you tell him to stop it, he'll do it twice. And so, you just got to let that go, live with it. And to your question in Colombia, in some ways it's premature. And I think ultimately the president might tell you that it's up to the Colombians. It's not his responsibility. As you hear sometimes from within Colombia, wow, president's comments are helping Petro, and Petro had nothing to fly the flag around, but now he's got these arguments that the president tossed to him in an underhanded fashion. The president's going to say BS. That's and no one can predict that. I think it's up to the Colombians, and the elections are, I think March you have to pick your candidates, May are the elections, August is the inauguration. So we don't have that many months left. The problem is that Petro has an incredible ability to stir the pot and harass and be provocative every day.
If we see Brazil and the role of President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in all of this, he tried as a relevant voice in the continent to be a mediator. Okay, not only in the recent months, but historically he's been trying just to play that role. Whether or not he was successful or not is up to the debate. The question right now is the relationship between the two countries, imposing the Trump administration tariff earlier. I mean, it's mid last year, to a situation where right now are pretty much has been sort of like a reset, and everything is heading into a better sort of like a horizon. What do you make out of this?
Well, I mean, it was a reset until the president announced that anyone doing trade with Iran would get 25% tariff. So that's a message of Brazil right there. Everything they worked hard at is undone. And it forces the Brazilians. I thought the Brazilians were lucky. They were fortunate and lucky in two things. First of all, remember what we talked about, personalistic presidency, and the president went out and spoke to Lula, and Lula believes he has charm over leaders as well, and so they came to some agreement. But I would have bet that it would have been a rockier road, but maybe the trade balance in favor of the United States, significantly in favor, may have swayed the Americans to back off a little bit from the Brazilians. But now that the Brazilians have been so vociferous against the U.S. action in Venezuela and managed to corral the other kind of pathetic leftist governments, it's all predictable. They got, the same old. Boric is leaving. He signs off on it. The Uruguayans, the Mexicans, the Colombians, and the Brazilians, and that's it. And you better believe that the administration is looking at that and saying, is that behavior the kind that would merit any sort of, a pass in the world of tariffs and that sort of business. I think the Brazilians are probably playing with fire and overplaying their hand. Right now they're okay, but they might not, as soon as the U.S. catches its breath, and if they continue to push on this issue and leading countries against the U.S.'s position on Venezuela, I think that you might see some punishment from the side of the U.S. and punitive action
in there, pushing your crystal ball and rubbing your crystal ball in there. Do you think that the right in Brazil, with Jair Bolsonaro right now imprisoned, in house arrest, etc., and they needed to decide what they're gonna be the next candidate, in there.
Flavio or something.
No. And then we have President Lula trying to just be again the candidate and the actual winner of the race. Do you expect what do you expect in the election in October?
Yeah, I really don't know. Lula's been very. I mean, the I think the PT is dead, but Lula is the PT, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing else, and if the right had picked a better candidate, and there were several out there that could have pulled it off, several governors that could have not just Tarcísio, but other governors out there. Junior is one. They could have probably played their hand and gotten a good chance at it. I don't know if they can get behind Flavio or anyone else in the Bolsonaro family. And I think the United States, they'll watch this, but the president, one thing that the president doesn't do is he doesn't double down on bad bets. That, by the way, is one of the reasons that he's had such a hard time accepting the Venezuelan opposition. He learned a lesson the first time around that he had invested way too much, and that had been a bad investment. And those sorts of things he doesn't tend to repeat as a businessman.
Before getting here, I asked ChatGPT when what can we say about the moment that we're living in? Especially after they received this as a big reference of the Monroe Doctrine, etc. I asked ChatGPT, can you just try to summarize for me, what is this moment? ChatGPT is telling me, hey, this is a period of revival and contestation, a phase in which the U.S. is confronting China's economic influence in the region, as well as Russia and Iran political and security engagement. If I ask you the same question that I asked earlier to ChatGPT, how do you define? Give me a label, give me something that we can take home tonight.
Our region needs to reassess and reflect. The president's giving an opportunity in what he's doing for countries to take care of their own business. And when that business isn't taken care of, that the U.S. Harbors the option, exercises the option to be able to jump in there. If you don't like it, if you are against, I don't know, maritime vessels being blown up in the Caribbean, then get rid of the drugs so that they never reach a maritime vessel. It's within your power. It's well within your power to exercise to eliminate these things. Eliminate the coca, it will never make it to the boat won't be blown up. And so I would say, reflection, and there's an opportunity in all this.
Okay, now let's take a couple of questions from the audience, and we're gonna do it. We're gonna just do this if it's okay with you. We're gonna take two questions at a time, because I know that there are many of them, in here, and we allow Juan to answer, and we move forward. Sounds good. That we have one question here for the gentleman and the lady here, please. Can you identify yourself quickly and please be as direct as possible?
Hi, I'm Isabel Bento. I'm the CEO for LATAM at BlackRock. Very interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I wondered if you have any views on what's going on with Greenland and the president's view on the relationship with Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Rodolfo Ramos, Mexico strategist for Bradesco. I appreciate the view. It's certainly on the much more pessimistic, particularly on the Mexico side, that I've heard on USMCA, on strikes, and the USMCA review as well. What are the odds that you assign to these events actually happening as you see them? And do you think that DC understands that destabilizing Mexico would actually be counterproductive to some of those goals that the U.S. has, particularly around immigration and the very drug cartels? Thank you.
Okay. Love the Greenland question. I was hoping to avoid it. Greenland this is where a little bit of the historical nerding out. Greenland is in our hemisphere. And I'm trying not to if you look at Greenland, the U.S. has exercised more influence and presence in Greenland than the Danes have ever. And if you go back, and I would suggest that you pull up, it's not hard to do, in the State Department, like the declassified documents, and then it's called FRUS, like Foreign Relations of the U.S. And if you look for the documentation, this is remarkable. The U.S.'s first true interest documented in Greenland is, before the First World War. And it makes a lot of sense, the submarines and impeding the maritime traffic between the U.S. and UK. I'm struggling here to try to make it brief. But listen, U.S. Virgin Islands, they used to be Danish colonies. 1917, the U.S. buys the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark because they're incapable of maintaining them so far away. This is all about the Panama Canal, which has just been built, and the entrances to the Caribbean. Greenland was just before World War II. The Brits realized that the Germans will probably crush Denmark, and they convinced the Danes to sign an agreement with the United States so the U.S. takes receivership of Greenland. And it does that, builds bases, impedes the Germans from taking it over, and guarantees the maritime flow to the UK. The war's over, 1945, 1946, 1947. The Danes show up in Washington. Greenland, remember we lent it to you. We kind of want it back. And the Americans said, "Qué pena con usted." They said, let's look into that. And the U.S., that's 1947, the U.S. signs today's document that governs today in 1951. During the Cold War, we had up to 50 military installations in Greenland. There's only one today, run by us. Always have had more U.S. troops than anybody else, more U.S. interests. Why is this all important? Because Trump sees this, and this was all before the critical minerals and the Arctic. And now there's a bigger reason. As expansionist president, he looks at this and he's like, if you look at the document, it's ours anyway. If you really look at the document, it gives us obligations of defense and development and these sorts of things. It's not a new thing. And so I know all of us feel uncomfortable. Poor Greenland. What are we going to do? 50,000 people. We'll make them citizens. Move on, But I get it. I understand everything surrounding it. But to him, it's a real thing. And it's about expansion. It's about denying it to the Russians and the Chinese. Because the Greenlanders are going to defend the critical minerals from someone else's interest? With whom? It's going to be the U.S. that defends it. Well, if we defend it, we might as well own it. I know this sounds crazy, but guess what? The Greenlanders, what do they have? Do they have a military? No.
But what about NATO? Will NATO will not be able to defend?
I think if you talk to NATO, some members of NATO think that the first time they send troops to Greenland, it might not be for the Chinese and the Russians. It's just an unfortunate circumstance. But I actually think that there's a decorous and creative way out. I just don't know if the Europeans had the stomach to do it. Now, in a complicated week, the Danes and the Greenlanders are in Washington this week. Tito Asfura met today, Maria Corina on Friday, Panamanian Canal Minister and Foreign Minister in town. There's a lot going on this week, and so keep an eye on it. This one's with Rubio. We'll see how it goes. I don't know how you get out of it. I'm sorry to give you but I'm very passionate about the issue, and it hurts me to see it, but, what other options do they have? I mean, we sound like bullies, right? But at the same time, it's de quién es si no es tuyo. It's like, I'm there already. And the question about Mexico, right? And I quibble with one term that you used, destabilization. That would destabilize somehow, or whatever term that you used on the issue of Mexico. There's some numbers that suggest that the Mexican people aren't that offended by, they are about unilateral military action, but not about doing away with cartel members. The president is looking out primarily for what he sees are the interest of the American people, not the interest of the Mexican people. And he's voted by the American people. And so his interests there are to safeguard those people who are trying to hurt his population. And the Mexicans have done a wonderful job, but there's a lot of work to be done. And if they're incapable of doing it, the president feels he'll do it for them.
Okay. So we have Ivan here, and the gentleman next to Juan Pablo here. So we have these two questions.
Thank you very much. Juan, I'd like to get your take on, you mentioned that President Trump, one of his priorities in the hemisphere is counter narcotics. How does he justify the pardon of President Orlando Hernandez of Guatemala?
Okay,
Honduras.
That's one.
Yeah, further on Venezuela, in addition to the reasons which led Trump to do what he did, to what extent this is really not so much about all that, and to what extent this is not so much about oil, but in one certain move, this was a very big move vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and as a consequence, Cuba is just going to slowly die out, for lack of a better reason. And you can see Rubio basically saying geopolitically, this is a very smart move. And right now, Trump can sit down with China in a world that they control 80-90% of rare minerals and critical minerals, which is strategically a very difficult position for the U.S. Now Trump can sit down and say, well, by the way, I control the oil, or a big portion of the oil that you buy. So from a leverage point of view, the situation has changed pretty dramatically. So to what extent this could be one of the main reasons, probably over some of the ones that, just to provoke you, some of the ones that you mentioned.
I feel your pain on Juan Orlando. I struggled to understand it myself, and knowing how he feels, I came up with the following. First of all, there's some appeal to him about a president in handcuffs and in jail that catches his attention. And then the aspect of a White House that's run in a decidedly different way that's been run at other times. You'll recall from Trump 1, one of the big problems early on was that there was a turnstile in the Oval Office, and anybody would show up in there and say anything. And then you had to work really hard to walk that back because the president was working off of information that had been supplied to him by someone who had just walked in, rather than the person responsible for that portfolio. Not the president's fault, right? It's those who are custodians of the gate. I can't help but think that the people involved on the other end that were paid to do this, for lack of a better word, tricked him, sold him a story that wasn't really the story that he thought he was signing off to. Shame on him, because it's his signature and his action. But if you listen to the questions asked by baffled journalists after that, his answers are, well, I really didn't know the guy, or they say good things about him. And, you could tell he was not the best informed person. Unfortunate, clearly a mistake in my book. Especially it's hard for all the, work done by the Department of Justice and U.S. law enforcement to get the goods on somebody like this. And it sends a mixed message. Others who think all you need to do is hire the right people, and you too can avoid going to jail in the U.S. for drug trafficking, right? On Venezuela, I think the president's probably ahead of you. His messaging, he was already a winner if he had never done anything in Venezuela. Just Operation Southern Spear. The first thing that happened was he showed the world he could have the deployment. He showed them that he could move this massive military might and navy and put it in an area in a historical way. He sent messages that it's the first glimpse of the Trump corollary, that I'm going to send and reinforce what I'm telling you. And those messages were heard loud and clear by Mexico and Colombia and even Brazil and perhaps Panama. The message got through. Other messages, quickly, countries that decided we too recognize that Cartel de los Soles is a narco-terrorist organization. 5 Latin American countries did that within a week. Win, 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 and so forth. So even if he had never done this, it would already be a win. And ultimately, I see some people out there saying China's a winner out of this. I don't see it. I don't see it at all. Not only that, but if you're a friend of Russia, Iran was already saying it. Jesus Christ, we got the hell beaten out of us and Russia did nothing. And we're sustaining your war in Ukraine. And now what happens in Venezuela? Same thing. The Chinese, you know what the Chinese took away? Chinese were very inward looking, right? You know what they took away? They had a foreign delegation visiting Maduro the day before he was taken. You know how the Chinese interpret that? They chose the day that after we met with him to send us a message. And then they didn't let us leave till afterwards, and they conducted this action. That message was for us. More powerful message than the one you're talking about.
Okay, next question do we have? We have a couple here. So Miranda, if you can, the gentleman here, there is another, Will has the as well. So let's start with the gentleman here, please. Let's load quickly because we're running out of time.
If we had to predict military action in the hemisphere, what would be the next action you predict? And would it be Mexico, Colombia? And is it Navy SEALs in Mexico? Is it 3,000 Marines? Or is it drone strikes? Or is it a mix of all three? Thank you.
Will Freeman here for the Council of Foreign Relations.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the intro. And thanks both so much for the conversation. What elements, if any, of the current policy, and I know this might sound strange, what elements of any of the current Latin American policies do you think might actually survive into a next administration, even if control turns over to Democrats? And do you think this America's first moment in foreign policy, does it have any staying power past this administration, or is it just driven by the proclivities and interests of this particular set of people? Thanks.
So I always use the past as a predictor of the future on the type of attack. In this case, the first attack on Venezuela was conducted against a drug storage area in La Guajira, in a remote area that didn't kill any people, but destroyed a storage of cocaine in a well-known site by a drone. That was the first attack on Venezuelan soil by the United States. I would predict that we're looking at something similar to that. And as I said earlier, I wouldn't focus, if you forced me to name a country, I would say Mexico. And I would say, going back to this gentleman's question, I would say sooner rather than later. I would say definitely in 2026, probably earlier than you would expect. They're just looking for the opportunity. They're riding a wave of optimism and overconfidence right now. So why not strike while the iron's hot? And, but if you didn't force me to give a country, as I said earlier, I think the borders don't matter, and you will hit the target wherever you find it. And if that's Honduras or Guatemala or Barbados or whatever, so be it. Right. I think the country becomes less important in the strike itself, although I recognize that, of the importance of where it lands. And then your question that goes basically to the longevity of policy, I'd say if nothing else, it's influenced it, and it will have. You could probably believe that it will have a lingering effect. It just won't go away. You just don't close a chapter. Look what happened with Washington. Donald Trump in the first administration changed the way Washington operated entirely. Anything you knew about Washington, forget about it. That's not how it was handled. Biden comes in. What's he do? He doesn't go to status quo ante. He doesn't follow Trump. And then Trump comes in for all he learned in the first time around, and those 4 years where, as you can tell, they prepared and they developed and they matured policy and ideas. Normally parties aren't that good at that. And they did it, and that's what you're seeing today. I tell my clients in Latin America, I say, among the many things I talk about the administration, I say, what those countries that knew us the best know us the least. Because you're using a playbook, a script that's no longer legitimate. Things have changed.
One final question, and that's because Rich, the lady there is raising. I think did you raise your hands in there? No. No. So there is one person there raising the hand. Please, just quickly so we can squeeze that. Thank
you. Good evening. Miguel Arroyo from Access Capital. We had talked about Cuba. We had talked about Venezuela. We haven't talked about Nicaragua. I wonder, what do you think is going to happen with Ortega and Murillo in Nicaragua? Thank you.
It's you have to look at, among many other things, the alternatives. What are the alternatives in Nicaragua? Part of the problem is that if you think the Venezuelan opposition is fragmented, look at the Nicaraguan. If there are 5 Nicaraguans in the room, they have 7 opinions. And so that hurts the prospects of getting the United States behind you. And it's been going on for a long time, and no one, even USAID and IRI and others who have tried to jump in and try to give some shape to this, haven't been able to do it very successfully. So the Nicaraguan opposition needs to put their house in order before they can expect anything else, because it's not just getting rid of the other guys, it's what comes next. And then if you saw, apparently Ortega's, in a preemptive fashion, has released some prisoners, figuring, why the hell not? Let's get on the right side of this. If you look at people who look at these kinds of things like Rubio and stuff, you can see that obviously that would be an aspiration for them to liberate Nicaragua. But the fact is that to liberate it for what? For whom? For where? And I can tell you, first time around in the Trump administration, it took us a long time to get, you'll recall it was the infamous civil unrest in 2018. It took us a long time to recognize it. And then once we recognized it, we couldn't get our hands around it, because you recall, it was not organized. It was a student movement, and there was you couldn't hold on to anything. And then there was probably a lost moment there that we could have acted. I don't know the conditions are in Nicaragua that could even possibly even replace that. But you're asking a lot for the United States to do something. My prediction is, they'll go into fake elections. They'll continue to repress. They'll do what they do. And unfortunately, they might actually pass us on to another Ortega.
On that note, last question. What would you consider will be your biggest prediction for this year? What do you think is going to be, for all of those we are here in this room, guys, better watch out this set of actions, this country, this policy, you name it.
So I would say, if we don't linger on what has taken place and is taking place, but instead take that and project what is that I would say that there's a lot of opportunity here to correct behavior. Let me use an example I'm thinking of now is, like, what do you think is going to happen with the United States and China? In the past, we would go to various countries and say, listen, the Chinese have all these projects, and the countries would say, yeah, but nobody else bid on it. It was just the Chinese, or they outbid everybody else. And then, for a very brief period of time, the U.S. has been saying that's no longer any good. They say, well, the United States didn't bid on anything. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? A lot of reasons. But now we said it's not good enough for you to use that excuse. Now you have to go to the U.S. companies and tell them that you're going to have a bidding process and seek them out. I think as we read what's happening in the room, the new Trump corollary, you need to bring those U.S. companies in, and you need to give them preference, and you need to encourage them to bid on your projects, and they get first right of refusal. The other thing I would like, something similar to the oil in Venezuela, right? And then if you look at something else, I would say, like, the opportunities you have to correct behavior, you have quite a few mines in the region that are run by the largest gold mines in Colombia and Peru. You've got multiple public securities. Everybody knows there's no money to be made in public securities, but yet the Chinese are gobbling them up in Brazil and Peru. What's that about? And I would say, if you have a chance to correct behavior, the port of Chancay is a perfect place to start. And I suspect that it will act as a little bit of a kind of a gravitational pull for something. It was very convenient to talk about the port of Chancay, but not really knowing what to do about it. But I think with a new Trump corollary, we'll find the port of Chancay a new opportunity to see if there is room for reversal, and what reversal looks like, and whether that's a lesson and an opportunity to model behavior for other countries.
The Saturday Night Live moment that I call in here is the following one. And I'm using this because every time that I'm in the stage, I'm feeling that I'm hosting Saturday Night Live. One for you is, you have lived in 8 countries in the region. You are from Puerto Rico. What is the best food? Favorite one.
You're getting me into big trouble here, but I will say Peruvian. I lived in Peru, and Peruvian food is phenomenal, especially if you go off the beaten path and you go to Huariques, or the little mom and pop places where the plates don't match, and also if you go into the interior and places where where people usually don't go, in the Amazon or in the Andes, and you try a dish that normally, like CD, like the little like the worms from the, and so, which you normally might not get, and you think, well, I probably should eat it cooked because it'll taste better than raw. You're probably making a mistake. But I think the Peruvians had just a lot of creativity. A lot of our other countries have phenomenal food or really incredible access to raw material, but I think that the Peruvians can really bring it, and there's a reason there are Peruvian restaurants everywhere.
Okay. On that note, we have to thank you, Juan, for you,
Thanks a lot for your
open
attention.
mind, and